Welcome to the Creative Play and Podcast Network. Join us as we review our favorite RPGs, collectible card games, MMOs, video games, PC games, and bring up interesting topics and things that we'd like to share with everyone. Sit back and enjoy the show.
Hi, this is Kelly, aka Trixie from Ragnarok and Roll, a Scion to Ragnarok story, and Tilda Wimblewick from D&D Journey of the 5th Edition. First off, I would just like to say thank you to everyone for listening to our varied adventures, as well as for rating us on iTunes and rpgpodcast.com. If you haven't rated us yet, we would greatly appreciate it if you could. And if you're looking for more ways to support our efforts, we are now on Patreon, a great site where you can help us continue making more podcasts, as well as some special surprises for our patrons. If you can, please look us up at www.patreon.com/cppn. Every little bit helps. And again, thank you for listening.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Guys all having a good time? That's what we like to hear. Yeah, I am. Except for breakfast. That was not... What was that? It happens at so many cons, you know. They have a restaurant that presumably serves like regular breakfast, but then the fans arrive and they say, no, you have to eat this buffet here with these 4 tired-looking things. So this panel is just billed as an hour with me, I guess. So what I thought I'd do here is just sort of ramble incoherently for a bit, and then our moderator here will ask a few questions, and then we'll probably.
Normally panels start off with introductions, but does anybody not? There we go. Okay, thank you. Normally panels start with introductions, but does anybody not know who this is?
What does the RR stand for?
My middle names. So we've moved all the walls, and that has revealed more chairs. I've been told that this convention is very strict about chairs. No standing or sitting in the aisles that you see at some conventions. You must have your butt in a chair.
We have a very strict fire marshal. Other conventions that have been here.
Can you hear me?
Scott, can you get Zach in the enemy room?
I can get it.
Oh, wait, we got it, Scott.
Someone talk.
Okay. Hi. Hello.
Other guy talk.
Okay.
I can talk to you.
Go again.
Okay? Can you hear us now? Suspicious porcupine. No pops, no S's. Oh. Okay.
So who am I? The point was raised of who am I? That's actually an interesting point because I've been thinking about it a lot myself lately. Not only who am I, but why am I? Why am I the way I am? And this has been put in light for me by the recent election that we may have had. We have had this election, and I have expressed some opinions on my blog, which of course has gotten me a lot of attention and support in some ways, but also criticism, and there were some interesting debates about it, and it's caused me to think about why I have some of the attitudes that I have, some of the political views I have. And in reflecting on it, I think a lot of it is because I'm a science fiction guy. Yeah, I'm known for fantasy these days mostly, but of course, fantasy, when I was growing up, was like part of science fiction. Science fiction was much bigger. They're both branches of imaginative literature, as I see them. And I was born in 1948, so I largely started reading comic books and then books in the 1950s. I was reading the science fiction of the 1950s, the comic books of the 50s, and of course, before the science fiction of the 40s and the 30s, which when I could get that. And there wasn't much fantasy around then, not until there was Conan and Tolkien came along in the early 60s. But mostly it was science fiction. And I wrote a lot of science fiction. I still love science fiction. I hope to write more of it one of these days. I grew up reading that stuff. And I look back on it now, and I think it's not the sole factor, but it's one of the factors that really shaped my political attitudes and where I stand in the culture war that is now dividing this nation and indeed the world. I don't know if you guys, and I know TusCon is a very old convention, because evidently I was guest of honor here in 1980. Which I hardly remember, but I don't know if you ever had Gordon R. Dixon here. Gordy Dixon, did he ever come to a TusCon? Does any of the old timers remember?
We weren't able to get him.
No? Gordy was a great guy, of course, a terrific science fiction writer. And a lot of fun at conventions and at parties. He was known to imbibe a little. or a lot. This thing is really getting annoying here. I think it has to be turned back down. But the thing that Gordy never actually wrote, or never wrote because of the market forces at the time, but visualized. He had this grand idea for a series of 9 books that was going to be his magnum opus. And what he wanted to do was write 3 books of historical fiction, 3 books of contemporary fiction set in, the 50s and 60s, the time that we were living in then when he came up with this scheme, and 3 books of science fiction. And the 9 books would all relate together, and the theme of the 9 books would be the moral evolution of mankind. Because Gordy believed that there was moral evolution going on, and he would show in the historical fiction how things that were considered perfectly normal and natural in the past, things like patriarchy and racism and slavery and war, they were not considered evils. They were considered like part of the world that was, and the heroes engaged in these things. Good men owned slaves and engaged in these things. But over time, just as mankind and people had evolved, there was a moral evolution going on, and the attitudes of the contemporary were different, and the future would be still different. And it was a grand scheme, and I think I was one of the people. Gordy gave many interviews about this. He talked about his plan. But like everybody else, he had mortgages to build, to pay, and all that. So he wrote the 3 science fiction novels, and then they wanted more science fiction novels, and he wrote them, and they wanted more science fiction novels, and he wrote them. He never got around to writing the 3 historical novels or the 3 contemporary novels, so his grand scheme was never carried out. But I've always remembered him talking about it, and I think he made a very persuasive case for this idea of moral evolution. And I'm someone, and you can tell from my fantasy where I steal unashamedly from history, that I read a lot of history too. And I think there's evidence for what Gordy described. Now, history is not a straight line. It doesn't just go forward. It goes forward 3 steps, and then goes back 2 steps, and then it goes forward 3 steps. We can look at history, and there are some amazing, ugly parts in it. I mean, I think in the early 20th century, they'd had almost a century of peace in Europe, and they really thought they had gotten somewhere and arrived at a new and kind of more civilized thing. But then boy, then World War I happened, and that kind of threw a monkey wrench into it and destroyed the society. And then after World War I, things got really funky, and then of course the Nazis happened, and a lot of people looked at it afterwards, how the fuck could the Nazis happen? I thought, well, we were really better than that, but maybe we weren't. Maybe that was just one of the step backwards after 5 steps forward or whatever. So history is not a straight line and all that, but I think by and large it's a straight line if you look at it. And the straight line is predicated, to my mind, on humanity coming together and becoming one people. And my attitude towards this, I really look to think, was shaped by the science fiction I read when I was young, by people like Isaac Asimov and Robert A. Heinlein and Edmund Hamilton and all of these guys. That, the dream of going out to the planets and going to the stars was a dream for humanity. Now, you can look at the stories they wrote and said, well, most people in them are kind of like white male American guys. And yeah, maybe they were, but they weren't labeled as white male American guys. They were called Earthmen or Terrans. We were all like one person. And there were some writers who played with this, even in the context of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and 60s. I was rereading a Poul Anderson novel recently, and Poul was another terrific writer about this. He was politically conservative, but he was also very much a humanist and like a globalist. And in a lot of his societies, there are like Polynesians and Maori characters and characters from Africa. Skin color didn't seem to matter to him even, and he reflects in his variety of Earthmen. He may have a spaceship crew that contains a Maori character and a Chinese character and an American character, but the political divisions are all gone. That's just their ancestry and that's their culture. They're all part of Earth. They're all part of whatever it was, the Polysotechnic League, or Asimov's first empire and all that. And we're facing off aliens. There's this thread there. And reading all these stories when I was young, I think really got me thinking that way. Thinking that we are one common humanity and we have more in common with each other. There are more things that we share than that divide us. And I think that's why I have some of the political attitudes I do. I don't really comprehend some of the arguments I've gotten recently on some of the issues that divide us. About 6 months ago, I blogged about the Syrian refugees and why we have a humanitarian duties to let in the Syrian refugees, as many as we can take, because they're women and they're children and they're men too, and they're trying to get away from the war and trying to save their families, and they're in dire need, and that's what we're all about here, America. Give us your tired and your poor and your huddled masses yearning to be free, and also, the people who don't want to be tortured and killed and bombed. Even aside of yearning to be free, yearning to be alive is a powerful incentive too. And I remember I got in one debate with a guy who said, well, some of them might be ISIS spies and they're terrorists, they're coming in. And, well, yeah, some of them probably are. But most of them aren't, and in fact there's probably 1,000 who aren't, or 10,000 who aren't, for every one who is. And the guy I was debating with said, well, yeah, I don't care, but what if I don't want to let in even one? What if that one comes in and he kills 23 people in a terrorist act? And I said, well, yeah, that we take that risk, but number one, all the previous waves of immigrants have had some bad guys in them too. I'm descended from immigrants, from Italian immigrants, from Irish immigrants. Well, the Irish immigrants had a few terrorists in them too. People who were working for the Fenians and raising money and sending it back to attack the British. They were there too. And the Italian immigrants, most of them were perfectly hardworking guys, but they were the ones who were like the mafia. You heard of the mafia? So there's always some bad guys in any group you let in. There's no group you can let in, how much you vet them, who are like all good and all the time, and everybody is a saint. But you have to take the risk, right? We're land of the free and home of the brave. And the guy I was debating with said something. He said, well, I don't care, if one American life is lost because we let in someone we shouldn't, then the blood is going to be on your hands and the hands of President Obama and whoever lets them in. And that really struck me, the way he phrased it, one American life, because it's clear that he didn't read a lot of science fiction. He's thinking of American lives. I say, okay, so what you're saying here is that one American life is worth 100,000 Syrian lives, or is more important to that. And it really clarified why maybe as a science fiction fan my thought is different. I see these people who are ranking what they are when they talk about their own identity, and they say, well, I'm an American first and a Republican second and a Arizonan third, or whatever it is, and a member of the Lions Club fourth, and etc. Or some of them put Christian ahead of American. Anyway, there's these rankings here, and I thought about that. I'm not an American first, and maybe because I read science fiction, I'm a Terran first. I'm a human being first. And I have this sympathy for other human beings, no matter what side of the giant ice wall they happen to be born on. And I think I can see this reflected in my work, and some of that, not all of that comes from science fiction. I mean, obviously there were other influences on my life too that were important. I was born to a family in Bayonne, New Jersey, a very blue-collar family. My father was unemployed for a long period of time during my formative years. Well, it was only like a year and a half, but it seemed like 50 years, when you're a kid. So we were just living on his unemployment checks, and we were living in a federal housing project. It was an integrated project, so we had other people in there. We had black people, we had Jewish people. We didn't have many Muslims because there weren't any around then, but we did have a variety of different flavors of Catholic, which Bayonne mostly was. The Polish Catholic, the Italian Catholic, the Irish Catholics. In those days, a mixed marriage was when an Irish Catholic married an Italian Catholic, which was, like my parents. And of course, that's a powerful influence too. That sets your mind. So I didn't tend to think of like Jews as being something. I thought of Mark Shapiro, who lived in the apartment upstairs, and his older brother Eric, who was like the coolest guy I knew, and always had girls and stuff like that. And I didn't think of black people or Negroes, as we called them, as separate. I thought of my friend Skipper Baker and his sister Dolores, who was my sister's best friend for a certain period of time. And they went to school with us, they played with us, they were all there, we were all like people together. So that was a powerful influence too. That's the value of kind of integration and people living with each other and coming on. You become people, you don't become these broad classifications, these generalizations. But science fiction was a big part of that too, because in science fiction I read about other things. I read the Tom Corbett Space Cadet series. Was the juvenile series I read first. Kerry Rockwell, which was a pseudonym, of course, 8 books about Tom Corbett, the Space Cadet, and the Polaris crew. And you look back at it now and you say, well, it's all like white guys. Yeah, it was all white guys. But one of them was a Venusian and Astro. And even though Astro was like a white guy, he got a lot of shit for being Venusian. You Venusians, they all smell bad, and do you really have webbed feet? And he got a lot of shit. And his friends, Tom Corbett and Roger Manning, had to stand up for their friend Astro, who was the astrogator or the engineer on the ship. And you know, I don't think the science was rigorous. I think Astro was down on the engine deck where he was shoveling uranium into the uranium furnace, but but nonetheless, it was like a lesson in prejudice and accepting people who are different from ourselves. So all of that helped, I think, shape the way I am, and I'm glad it did, because I like that, and I like these attitudes, and I like the fact that science fiction has always been on, I don't know, I guess you could call it the progressive side of the agenda, but you could also call it, to my mind, the humane side of the agenda. But even some of the people, I mean, we think of Heinlein as this arch-conservative, because he did become kind of militaristic and somewhat conservative in his later life. But number one, he was never really conservative. He was sort of a libertarian, and he was extremely liberal on some matters, like sexual matters. He had women on his starships. He had women engineers and women starship captains and women soldiers when nobody else was doing that.
I think it's safe to say that Heinlein did not believe that marriage was just between a man and a woman.
No. Heinlein believed in, what at various points was called free love, and later open relationships, and later, I guess, polyamory and so forth. But he believed in that in 1912 or something like that, when he was getting married. Nobody else believed in that then. It was pretty daring stuff. But he also had black characters. You know, it's easy to lose sight when we look at Starship Troopers that Juan Rico, the hero of Starship Troopers, is Philippine with brown skin, in a book that he wrote in like 1958 and 59. So, you know, Heinlein was out there, and he was a Democrat, not only a liberal Democrat, but sort of a radical Democrat. He ran for Congress in California. He lost, but he was part of the Upton Sinclair campaign, End Poverty in California, which was well to the left of the New Deal. And he, you can read some of his letters when the first atomic bomb was exploded after World War II, at the end of World War II. And of course, Heinlein had wanted to fight in World War II. He was an Annapolis graduate. He was very patriotic and all that. But when that first atomic bomb came off, he wrote to some of the other science fiction with him saying, you know, this is going to be our destruction. What we have to do, this means we really have to come together as one world. We really have to join together. And otherwise, this atomic bomb is going to destroy us. What we should do is we should give the secrets of the atomic bomb to the United Nations, which was just forming, and we should make them the world's policemen, and only the United Nations would have the atomic bomb in order to police the world. Now, the United Nations didn't turn out to be quite what I think its founders envisioned, and I think later than that was in 1945 that Heinlein was espousing those sentiments. Obviously, by 1960s and 70s, he had changed considerably. But the fact that he did have those opinions, I think, was interesting. And indeed, you read some of Heinlein's future history, and he's very prescient about some of the political changes that would be going through. I hope he's not too prescient about the rise of Nehemiah Scudder. Although recently I began to think maybe he was right about that too. And we'll probably find out in the next few years, but I hope not. You know, sometimes people make predictions about the future and where we're going, and they attach certain dates to it, or it's assumed that there's dates, and then it doesn't happen on schedule, and people say, oh, they were wrong. I don't think that's always true. I think sometimes just the timing is wrong. I think, you know, people now say Malthus was wrong about the problems of population growth because it didn't happen exactly the way it said. Malthus was not wrong, he just got the timing wrong. population growth will still overwhelm this planet and destroy all of us if it's allowed to continue unchecked. And people say Heinlein was wrong in that 1945 thing. Was he said this atomic bomb thing is going to destroy us all if we don't all get together and come together as one world. And then we can look back, and even Heinlein said, well, I guess I was wrong about that. Well, no, you weren't wrong about that, Bob. That was right. It just hasn't happened yet, but it will happen. It will happen. We avoided the big World War III with the Soviet Union, but as more and more countries get more and more atomic bombs, and I don't know how you stop that. You can try to stop it, you can delay it with treaties and things like that, but it's like knowledge, and knowledge has a way of spreading. You can't keep it secret, and it used to be one country had the atomic bomb, then two, now we're up to 12 or something like that. And it's not going to stay at 12, they're going to be more. And crazy countries like North Korea have it. That is a destruction that's waiting for us all, regardless of the timetable. Heinlein was right about that. So these are some of the things that inform my own thinking. And Heinlein also gave a speech at the Third World Science Fiction Convention, where he was talking about what makes science fiction fans, writers and readers, different from other people, what we would now call mundanes, although that's sort of a... And his theory was it was a capacity for something called time binding, the ability to think seriously about far future and past events, and rather than just the stuff that's immediately in front of them. And I think that's a good point. There's a certain amount of validity to that. At least I see that reflected in myself and some of my friends. I mean, as I watched this political campaign for the presidency go down this year, there were many things about it that horrified me. But one of the things, and you've all read a million postmortems about it, we've all been sunken in this for years. But one of the things that really struck me is nobody was talking about global warming. We had 3 debates, and there was not a single question about global warming. At one point Hillary said Donald doesn't believe in global warming, and he said, wrong. On the other hand, he has said that he doesn't believe in global warming, and he thinks it's a hoax by the Chinese. So, and many of the people on that side don't believe in global warming. But global warming is happening, whether you believe in it or not. The scientific community is there, and being a time binder and a science fiction guy, people are looking ahead at what's going to happen to them and their families next year. That's perfectly justified. We all think like that. We're all human beings. We're worried about what's going to happen to us and our family and our friends a year from now. Politicians are thinking what's going to happen in the next 4 years, because they're not going to get reelected unless they turn things around in 4 years. But I think it's only the time binders who are thinking, what's going to happen in the next 100 or 200 years? Because I guarantee you, 100 years from now, nobody is going to be talking about Hillary's emails. That's going to be in the history books with the Credit Mobilier scandal and the Teapot Dome scandal. And because we're time binders, there's probably a lot of people in this room who know what the Credit Mobilier scandal was and the Teapot Dome scandal was. But outside in the real world, where the people aren't time binders, those are like nonsense words. Also, 100 years from now, nobody's going to care about Billy Bush or how many pussies Donald grabbed. That's going to be remembered like Grover Cleveland's illegitimate child, or Warren G. Harding's mistress, or how many people John F. Kennedy shagged, which evidently was quite a few. Sex sells, as someone said on the previous panel, and we're always interested in salacious details. What they are going to be saying in 100 years is, guys, why were you talking about Hillary's emails when the oceans were rising and the ice caps were melting? Remember when we used to have a state of Florida, where now there's a bunch of small islands? Remember, you're worried about the Syrian refugees. There's 100,000 of them, 500,000 of them. What happens when the entire nations of Micronesia and Polynesia And coastal enclaves all over the world go under the waves, and we're going to have millions of boat people looking for a place to live. What happens in parts of India are having temperatures of 120 and 130 degrees just in the last year. I spent one night in Death Valley, and you can't, there's a reason they call it Death Valley. You can't live for long at 120, 130 degrees is the average temperature. People are going to leave those things and are going to start moving with their families because everybody wants to live and have food and have a life. You can't live at that temperature. So this global warming thing is kind of a big thing. It should have gotten a little more attention in the presidential election. So, but maybe that's because I'm a science fiction guy too and I'm doing these time bombs. Anyway, so those are my rambling thoughts about why I am the way I am and why I feel the way I do. And I don't know what to do about it except to keep writing and to keep talking and blogging and making my points about that. Why don't I throw it open to you for some of your questions? And
Thank you. My questions aren't going to be about the world and politics. They're mostly going to be about you, since we have you here. The first question is something... into the mic. The first question is something that we all want to know the answer to. Will the great and powerful turtle be in the Wild Cards TV show?
we really need Melinda Snodgrass here to answer that. Yes, we have a Wild Card TV show that's under development from Universal. The script has not been written yet, so we don't know what characters are in and what characters are out. The good thing about Wild Card is we have 1,000 characters. The bad thing about Wild Card is we have 1,000 characters, and you can't fit them all into any one thing. Ideally, I'd love it if we didn't just get one Wild Cards TV show. We got like 6 of them and had something, like they're doing with the DC universe with Flash and Supergirl and it's yada yada, or the Marvel universe with. That they're doing on Netflix with Daredevil and Jessica Jones and Luke Cage. But I don't know if they're going to go that way. But, I have this show called Game of Thrones at HBO, and HBO has signed me to what's called an overall deal, which means that HBO owns my pale white ass. And I can only work for HBO. So I cannot participate in the development of Wild Cards at Universal. That's in the hands of Melinda Snodgrass and a fellow named Gregory Novak, who is the producer attached to it. So, sadly, Melinda's not here to answer your question.
Okay, there is another series that people are interested in. What can you tell us about The Winds of Winter?
I'm working on it.
Okay, asked and answered, everybody. You're known for developing complex characters. How do you give them such depth?
That's an interesting question, and I think it relates to what I said to my earlier remarks. I think it's empathy, which for some reason I absorbed at a very early age. I always asked myself the question, well, how would it feel if that was me? When I was a kid and there was all the civil rights things going on in the 50s and 60s in the South and all that, at first when I was very young, I couldn't even understand it because, as I said, I lived, with black people in the apartment next door and up above and all that. And, wait a minute, you mean there are places in the United States where I could go in and eat at a lunch counter, but Skipper and Dolores couldn't go in and eat at a lunch counter? Well, yeah, there is, And I didn't understand that. But then I went even beyond that, and I asked, well, how would I feel if that was me? And they said, you can't eat at this lunch counter. Well, I would feel bad. I wouldn't like that. And, I was not black. I didn't have the black experience, but I could empathize with that experience. And I remember reading Andre Norton had a book, called Beastmaster. I think it was Beastmaster, where it might be the wrong one, but the hero was an American Indian. And there was a lot of stuff in about it, the prejudice that he encountered as an American Indian, and the slurs and the put downs and, et cetera, et cetera. And you're reading that, and of course, Andre Norton was a white woman. Her real name was Alice Mary Norton. She was a white woman from Ohio. I don't know if she actually had any Indian blood or if she knew any Indians or anything like that. But up to that point in my life, the only Indians I'd encountered were on television and films, where they were always the enemy who came whooping over the horizon to kill everybody in the wagon train. But that Andre Norton book put me inside the head of an American Indian, and the magic of empathy took place. And while I was reading that book, I was, I think Hosteen was his name, Hosteen Storm or something like that. I was him. I was experiencing life as him, and I was feeling the injustice of what was being done to him. And I've always tried to keep those things in mind. And when I write from the viewpoint of a woman, obviously I haven't had those experiences. I've known people who have, but I always try to think, well, how would I feel if I was a woman and this was happening? And I'd want to make my reader feel that. When I'm writing from the viewpoint of a dwarf, obviously, I'm not a dwarf, but I can empathize with how would I feel with all of that. So I think empathy is always the key to creating any sort of character. Even villains. I mean, someone was talking on this last panel, and I came at the end about you have to have fully fleshed characters, even the villains. Yes. I mean, the Red Skull exists only in comic books and was not one of the greatest heroes anyway. Villains anyway. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, "Ha, what evil can I do today?" Everybody thinks there's a reason for what they do. Everybody is the hero of their own story. So even when I'm writing from the viewpoint of someone who's maybe not the nicest person in the world, like in my book, somebody like Victorian Greyjoy or Theon Greyjoy, they think they're justified in what they're doing. They have rationales, they have excuses. They may even think they're doing the moral thing by whatever lights that they've been taught are morality. And I have to get inside their skin for the time that I'm writing from their viewpoint and seeing through their eyes.
Okay. You've made New Mexico your home for a long time. I heard that when you first moved to New Mexico, you were involved in the New Mexico Mafia. What was your involvement with them?
Well, I was the hitman, of course. Whenever they needed someone whacked, they called me. No, there was no molten. That was just, the group of writers. New Mexico has a lot of writers. I don't know how we compare to you guys in Arizona, but I think we have more. None of them were born there, of course. Everybody kind of moved there. Well, Melinda was sort of born there, and maybe Vic Milan. But people like Roger Zelazny and me and Fred Saberhagen and many other writers were born in various other parts of the world, and then at some point discovered New Mexico. Ate some green chili, and then we became addicted, and we had no choice but to move down there so we could get our regular supply of green chili.
Can you tell us a quick story about how they actually came up with the name?
Of New Mexico Mafia?
Yes.
I didn't come up with it. I don't know.
Okay.
There was a lot of mafias in those days. The Milford Mafia was actually, when Damon Knight founded the Milford Writers Conference, he had a group of writers that he invited every year to Milford to critique each other's stories. Damon, I'm not sure how many of you remember Damon or know who he is. One, I guess. Damon was an immensely influential figure in the history of science fiction. he was a writer, but it's not as a writer that he was really so influential. It was really for the other stuff he did. I mean, he founded the National Fantasy Fan Federation. He founded the Science Fiction Writers of America. He founded the Milford Writers Conference. He helped found the Clarion workshops. He was always going around founding things. And Damon was a proselytizer. He had this view that we had to break down the walls of the science fiction ghetto, and science fiction had to mature and become more literary. He was one of the first great critics in the field. Before Damon, there was science fiction writers, when they reviewed each other, it was like all praise. It was sort of an unspoken thing. Well, we're all in this together, and we have to help each other. And it was the thumper rule: if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. Damon was not thumper. He came in there and said, no, we're only going to get better if we show what's wrong with these things. And he ripped books apart and flayed them in the early 50s, and including some giants of the field like A. Van Vogt. I mean, A. Van Vogt was never the same when Damon got through with him. But anyway, one of the things he founded was this Milford Writers Conference, where he invited particularly some established writers, also some young writers, to get together and criticize with this idea in mind that we had to become better, we had to become more literary, we had to do that. And there were certain other writers in the field, primarily older writers and more conservative writers, who didn't like this, and it became more. It became more heated when the old wave, new wave war began, which, again, I don't know how many of you remember that, but the late 60s, early 70s, there was a movement called the New Wave in science fiction, and then there were the older writers who didn't like that, and they were the old wave, and there was a big fights about it. And also Damon founded SFWA and Nebula Awards, and a lot of the Nebula Awards went to writers who went to Milford and who taught at Clarion, and who were associated with the New Wave and published in Damon's anthology Orbit. So the old wave writers, the people who weren't part of that, started deriding Damon and his group who went to Milford as the Milford Mafia. So it was actually the enemies of Damon and Milford who coined the term Milford Mafia. But Damon just laughed and took it happily and started calling themselves that. So we've had these fights and feuds in science fiction, they go all the way back. Admittedly, the present one, which with the puppies, is probably the ugliest and nastiest and worst we've seen. But it's not the first by any means. I mean, you can go back to the Futurians and the Exclusion Act and the old wave and the new wave and all of this stuff. And we may be a family, but we're kind of a quarrelsome family. Where there's always a crazy uncle that you got to deal with. Yes.
One last question before we have questions for the audience. You have been characterized in a lot of memes. Do you have any favorites?
What? Give me that one again.
You've been characterized in a lot of memes.
Yes.
Do you have any favorites, or would you just like to continue on?
No, I don't. I read on a DOS machine with WordStar 4.0. I don't get into that whole meme thing. I know I have a presence on Twitter and Facebook, but that's really my minions. I blog. That's about as advanced as I get, and then people pick it up and run with it. So.
Okay.
All right, we have a microphone in the middle, so come up to the microphone if you have a question, and I'll do the best to answer that. Hello.
What was your inspiration for creating the Society of Faceless Men, and was there anything in history that inspired it, or was it just a plot thing with Arya that you thought about, or what was your original inspiration?
My original inspiration for creating the Faceless Men, I don't know. It's a common trope of fantasy that you have like the Guild of Assassins. I was hardly the first one to invent the Guild of Assassins. that's largely a fantasy trope. There's not much evidence for that in history. Well, the one evidence is you did actually have a group called the Assassins, who were in the Middle East, and there was a guy called the Old Man of the Mountain who would send forth his assassins to kill people in the Middle East, where they've been killing people for many, many centuries. But they were not like fantasy guilds of assassins. So I decided to put my own spin on it, I actually came up with several different guilds of assassins, not only the Faceless Men, but the Sorrowful Men and all that. And there's a little bit in there in the philosophy of the Faceless Men. Is, they're, in some senses, they're a death cult, and it's a religious basis, which I kind of thought about and extrapolated from that. I'm surprised we don't have more death cults in the real world, because it just seems to me that if you're going to worship something, death is a pretty good thing, because, like, we have all these religions that promise you life everlasting. None of them ever deliver on it. Everybody in all the other religions that promise you worth dies anyway. So the death cult is the one that wins, The death cult can really deliver death. They say, come and worship with us and you will die. Well, yeah, you probably will. So, what the hell? So I took with that and ran with it. Yeah.
Hi there. I just wanted to
Is
ask...
that Westeros on your dress?
Yes, it is, of course. I just wanted to ask, I know you have quite a lot of Dunk and Egg series books planned. Are we ever going to see Tansel Too Tall again? Are we going to find out what happens to her?
Well, that would be telling. But I think there's a good chance, yes.
Yay.
Hi. So, whenever I first read your series, I of course sided with Daenerys since she has the land originally. But I'm a history teacher, and I'm teaching my students about the westward expansion. And as I'm teaching them about how the American citizens took over the land, I'm siding with us because we were able to use brute force. And if whoever wins the land is the original ownership. So my question is it, with your opinion, not trying to get your opinion on how the story will end, but even with that, and historically, is it the person who dominates it and with brute force, or is it the people who originally founded the land have ownership?
Well, human beings through all of history have been trying to sort this out, who has the right to the land. I mean, how far back do land claims go? You go far enough back and all the lands were Neanderthal man, and then he gets wiped out by Cro-Magnon, and or interbreeds with Cro-Magnon. Theories have now diverged on that point. And then civilizations come and go. I mean, you look at the British Isles, and in historical terms, you had the Picts and the Scots there originally, and the Celts. You might even have older groups than that if you believe the legends that Tuatha De Danann and the Firbolg were based on actual peoples who existed there before the Celts came. But then after the Celts, the Romans come in and they have their thing and they leave their deposits. And then after the Romans, you get the Angles and the Saxons. And after the Angles and the Saxons, you get the Normans. The Vikings come in, the Danes, they have a influence, they get a few kings. So history is written in blood, and the land doesn't belong to anyone except who takes it and what they do with the preceding inhabitants. If there's one thing history has taught us, it's that. I would like to think that Gordy Dixon was right, and that a moral evolution is going, and that 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, we will arrive at the point where history is no longer written in blood, but is written in ink or phosphors on a computer screen again, and where we are all Terrans, and some of us maybe. Well, you look at these DNA tests on Ancestry.com. I think we're all mongrels anyway. We just sometimes don't like to admit it to to each other.
Did you say mongrels or mongrels?
Mongrels. Mutts. We're mutts. The human race is mutts, and we need to become more mutts. All these, cries to France for the French, Germans for the Germans, America for the Americans. All of these are throwbacks, atavistic, xenophobic things, fear of the other, fear of differences, and hopefully eventually we'll leave this all behind. And I think we will eventually, because the more people live together, the more they fuck with each other, and children are born, and all the interbreeding occurs, whether we pass laws against it or horrified by it, and the cultural traditions happen, and people move into your neighborhoods and found a new restaurant, and you discover you like that food, and you meet the owners, and their children go to school with your children, and it's all, everything comes together, all these things, and I think that's the future there. Even in Westeros, of course, I've tried to indicate a sort of British history with the Westeros. I mean, you have the children of the forest first, and they're the only people there, and they really are a distinct species, and the giants, who are another distinct species. And then human beings come in, the first men, and of course, it's written in blood, so there's a lot of war, they kill each other, they form a treaty, but then here comes another invasion with the Andals coming in, and, eventually the Targaryens arrive with their dragons, and having a dragon really helps things. So, thank you. Hello.
Hello. All right. As you probably know, a lot of writers reflect themselves in their characters or put certain aspects of their character. And I'm wondering, what character in Game of Thrones did you most put yourself into? Which one most personified you?
Tyrion.
I knew it!
I am, however, taller. And, those quips that Tyrion tosses off at a moment's notice take me weeks to come up with. I'm one of these guys, I could have said something really witty there. I think of it 3 weeks later.
Hi, I'm a huge fan of Haviland Tuff.
Ah, cool.
And I noticed, it seems like a lot of the stories are very clearly pointing at different society issues. And I wondered if you're going to do any more of them. That's it. We're going to see more of him.
I have ideas for another 20 Tough stories, but I'm kind of busy with the Ice and Fire thing right now, so I don't know when I'll get around to writing them. At some point, sure. I even had at one point a contract for a second Tough book. The first collection was called Tough Voyaging, and the next one was going to be called Twice as Tough.
I would get that.
But I never wrote the stories, and I got involved in this other stuff, and I eventually bought out the contract by paying the publisher back. But someday I'd love to do that. He was a fun character to write, and those stories were kind of fun. They're a little lighter than most of my stuff. Well, they're not really a romp. There are entire worlds that are destroyed and stuff. But it's interesting what's considered light entertainment and what's not considered light entertainment. I've thought about that. Sometimes, you kill one character that the people know and love, and you get this reputation for being bloody. But you wipe out millions of people and no one blinks, It's like we look at Schindler's List as, this incredibly dark and gripping film about the Holocaust, and, we see people die, who are killed, who are shot and all that. And we consider Star Wars a light romp, but in Star Wars they blow up the entire planet of Alderaan. Before the story, I just felt a great disturbance in the forest, 50 billion people have just been snuffed out. And what's the next act? Okay. So it's odd the way, one death is a tragedy and 50 billion deaths are a statistic, as I think someone once said.
Maybe more of the immediacy.
So there are horrible things that happen in tough stories, but they're in the realm of statistics. So,
Okay, thanks very much.
thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
I've been an independent author for about 6 years. Big fan of your work.
Thank
Diving
you.
down, as you can tell. I follow your blog as well. You're not a blog, and I just wanted to know if you I can see that you're an ally to some indie authors. Do you have any advice? Because there's a persona there between the traditionally published authors and the indie authors. What's your take on that? Do you have any advice for up-and-coming authors in the sci-fi world?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think first of all, I'm not an expert on independent publishing.
Right.
I've never done it myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm, what you would call a traditionally
Yes.
published author. I do think that independent publishing is probably the wave of the future. We see the traditional publishers struggling in some sense. There's fewer and fewer of them. They tend to merge. The big 6 of a few years ago are now the big 5, and of course there used to be the big 20, or the big 10, and the medium-sized 30, and the slightly smaller 57. But on the other hand, there's a lot of things that have to be sorted out about independent publishing. I mean, before there was independent publishing, there was something called vanity publishing, where you paid to have your own book published. And of course, there were occasional success stories with vanity publishing, which the vanity publishers would always trumpet. Oh, here's a guy who published with us and he became a bestseller. But for everyone like that, there were 10,000 people who published with a vanity publisher, and they got 5,000 copies of their book, which are still in their garage, because there was no distribution, there was no support. And indeed, most of the books belonged in someone's garage because they were terrible. There were no gatekeepers. Traditional publishing has a series of gatekeepers where, the stuff that's really bad gets rejected. There are no gatekeepers with independent publishing, which means undoubtedly there are some good books being published independently. There's also a tremendous amount of crap. Some of it is like semi-crap, and some of it is like totally crap. And I know people want to write, they want to express their opinions, they want to get their dreams out, but sometimes it's sad. I mean, I go to conventions and I see people sitting with a table in the dealer's room with piles of their independently published book in front of them, desperately trying to sell a copy to anyone who goes by, and people are sort of hurrying by and not making eye contact because then they'd feel obliged to purchase the book. But I also see successes, and there's certainly Hugh Howey, was a great success with that, and certainly the distribution is low. And I know friends of mine who are established authors, Walter John Williams, for example, has recently put all of his backlist book on available as independent publications. And he told me recently he's making like $40,000 a year from it. Well, that's pretty damn good for a bunch of backlist books. And if it keeps up year after year. But what's important in his case is he established himself first as a writer published by traditional channels. And he's still doing his new books in traditional publications. So those are the locomotives that are driving the train, and then his old backlist books are being pulled along with the train. So it's a whole new game. I mean, I don't know the rules of this game to advise you. I know the rules of my game, and some people win and some people lose. And you can lose for a long time and then win. I mean, my career has bottomed out at least twice where I thought I would be selling real estate. But I kept at it. I mean, you have to keep, when you have a game where some people win and some people lose, the important thing is to keep playing, because you can't win if you don't play. And that may be true for independent publishing too, but when everybody is independently publishing, how are you going to know which books are good and which books are not good? How are you going to get the word out there about your books? How are people going to know what to review? I mean, there's so much of it. It's a whole different game, and
Right.
I don't know, but
Well, thank you.
good luck with it.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me ask you a question though. Did you choose independent publishing because you
Yeah,
preferred it to traditional publishing, or did you try traditional publishing, get nowhere, and then turn to independent?
I did not. I did like 3 weeks of research. I didn't sleep for hours. I couldn't decide, and I never even submitted to an agent. I said, indie is my way. You know, you make 70% of your profits, and as opposed to possibly 3% traditionally published. I mean, it just depends. I mean, unless you're you or Stephen King. There was a lot of factors. You get to control how you get edited and just the whole process.
Well, you do have control,
It's a lot faster
but
as
you,
well.
on the other hand, you have to do all these other jobs, like your own copy editing and your own editing, and you have to get to cover yourself, and yada, all of that stuff,
Right.
promotion and publicity. With traditional publishing, you have other people doing those things for you who are maybe better at these
Yes,
things than you are.
absolutely.
So
It was just a choice I made, and I just heard a lot of hybrids. A lot of indie publishers or indie authors get picked up from the big 6 or the big
Right.
5 because they do so well on Amazon. And it's just a hope of mine. We'll see.
all right, well,
Eventually.
good luck with it.
Thank you.
This is going to have to be the last question, so thank you very much.
Hi, as a fellow avid reader, I was wondering who some of your favorite characters you've read over the years in particularly fantasy literature, but literature in general. Who stands out to you?
My favorite characters,
Yes.
not writers.
No, characters.
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. Of course, I'm a huge Tolkien fan, and so, the characters from there, Frodo and Sam and Gandalf and Aragorn and Boromir. I always like great characters, so I have a thing for Boromir. Poor brave Boromir. Got arrows in him. I read like mysteries, detective fiction as well. Big fan of the Travis McGee books by John D. MacDonald. One of my favorite characters, Travis and his wounded birds. And of course, I read mainstream literature. The Great Gatsby is one of my all-time great books ever written, and I reread that one every few years. In science fiction fantasy, I mentioned Poul Anderson earlier. He had a character called Nicholas Van Ryn that I love. There were a whole series of books about him. The first one was called The Man Who Counts, although when it was published, it was serialized in analog, astounding back then, as The Man Who Counts. When it was published as a novel, they changed it to War of the Wingmen. But it's still a terrific book, and the first one to feature that character who came back many times. Who else do I like? I'm sorry, I'm getting away from science fiction and fantasy. Flashman. George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman books, historical adventures about, and that's interesting because Flashman was originally introduced in Tom Brown's School Days about a Victorian kid who went to a boarding school at, where was Eton or something like that, and Tom Brown, and where he was bullied unmercifully by this cad called Flashman, and that became a classic of Victorian literature and the basis of several mini-series on PBS and all that. But George MacDonald Fraser said, well, what happened to this Flashman guy after he was expelled for drunkenness from the school? And he wrote this whole series of marvelous adventures about how Flashman enters the army, and he remains a bully, a cad, a lech, a liar, a scoundrel, but a very charming one. And he's involved in every war of the 18th and 19th centuries, usually ends up running away with his tail between his legs, and yet gets acclaimed a hero and gets another medal and a promotion at the end of it. And the books are just a delight, and also a rich source of historical truth. You learn things about history you never learned before. So I know we're out of time. I could go on for another hour, but you know, I love to read. I love characters here. So anyway, thank you all for coming. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. But I will be around. I'll be, you know, sitting by a pool. I'll be in the con suite and things like that. So feel free to talk to me. I don't bite usually. And enjoy the con. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Creative Play and Podcast Network. And feel free to enjoy our other shows, such as D&D Journey of the 5th Edition and Scion Ragnarok and Roll, a Scion hero to Ragnarok story. Thank you for listening.